cut off from everyone. There are prisons designed to punish through confinement. And then there are prisons designed to disappear people, not hidden underground, not erased from records, but placed so far away from normal life that contact with the outside world slowly fades. For many inmates, isolation does not begin with a locked door. It begins with distance, miles from cities, hours from family, sometimes days from anyone who remembers them as more than a number. In these prisons, being incarcerated is only part of the sentence. The rest is being cut off. Visits become rare events instead of regular connections. Phone calls turn into short, carefully rationed moments. Letters take days, sometimes weeks, to arrive, if they arrive at all. And over time, silence becomes familiar. This kind of isolation doesn't announce itself loudly. There are no alarms for loneliness, no warnings for emotional distance. Life continues inside the facility, but life outside keeps moving without you. Birthdays pass without voices. Holidays arrive without faces. Family events happen without presence. The world doesn't stop, but access to it does. For inmates housed in America's most isolated prisons, separation isn't temporary. It's structural. These facilities are often built far from population centers, far from public view, and far from the people inmates rely on to stay connected to who they once were. Transportation is expensive. Travel is difficult. Time off work is limited. For many families, visiting becomes nearly impossible. And when visits disappear, something deeper begins to change. Conversations grow shorter. Relationships grow quieter. Memories start to feel distant, like stories from another life. Isolation doesn't just remove people from society. It slowly removes society from people. In these environments, inmates aren't just serving time. They are learning what it feels like to be forgotten. This documentary is not about daily schedules or prison systems. It is about distance, about separation, about what happens to the human mind when connection becomes rare and silence becomes routine. Because being locked up is one thing. Being cut off from everyone is something else entirely. Distance is the first wall. Isolation inside prison does not always begin with silence or solitude. For many inmates, it begins with distance. Long before a person settles into a cell, long before routines feel familiar, the reality of being cut off starts with where the prison is located. Across the United States, some facilities are built far from cities, far from public transportation, and far from the communities inmates come from. These locations are not accidental. They are chosen for land availability, security, and separation from population centers. But the human cost of that separation is often overlooked. For inmates sent to these remote prisons, incarceration immediately becomes a geographic problem. Families who once lived a short drive away now face journeys that take hours or even days. Visiting requires time off work, money for travel, and the physical ability to endure long trips. For many families, especially those with limited resources, these barriers quickly become overwhelming. What might begin as frequent visits slowly turns into occasional contact. And then, sometimes, none at all. Distance changes everything. A visit is no longer a simple event. It becomes a major commitment. Planning starts weeks in advance. Transportation must be arranged. Approval processes must be completed. Weather becomes a factor. Miss one connection, and the visit may be lost entirely. For parents, children, or elderly relatives, the effort can be too much. Inside the prison, inmates feel this shift almost immediately. Early on, many hold on to the hope that distance is temporary, that visits will resume, that loved ones will find a way. But as weeks turn into months, reality sets in. Visits are canceled. Phone calls become less frequent. Letters take longer to arrive. Silence begins to stretch. And silence, in isolation, carries weight. Without regular face-to-face contact, relationships begin to change. Conversations lose their immediacy. Updates feel delayed. Emotions are filtered through distance. Over time, it becomes harder to share everyday experiences because those experiences no longer overlap. Life inside and life outside drift apart. For inmates, this separation affects identity. People define themselves through relationships, family roles, friendships, responsibilities. When those connections weaken, so does the sense of self. An inmate who once identified as a parent, a sibling, a partner, or a provider may slowly feel those roles fading. Not because they stop caring, but because contact becomes rare. This can create a quiet sense of disappearance. Not erased, but gradually forgotten. Life outside continues. Children grow older. Families adjust. Events happen without input or presence. The inmate remains physically alive, but emotionally distant from the world that once shaped them. The prison environment reinforces this separation. Remote facilities often have limited visiting schedules, fewer visiting days, shorter hours, strict limits on physical contact. Even when visits occur, they may feel constrained and formal. Conversations happen under supervision. Time feels compressed. There is little room for normal interaction. When visits end, the distance feels even heavier. Phone calls, while helpful, are not the same. They are timed, monitored, and often expensive. Calls may be short, interrupted, or unavailable during lockdowns. When connection depends on availability rather than choice, communication becomes fragile. Letters provide another link, but they move slowly. By the time news arrives, it may already feel outdated. Emotional moments lose their immediacy. Responses are delayed. Over time, writing can feel one-sided, especially when replies come less frequently. This gradual reduction in contact creates emotional strain on both sides. Families struggle with guilt. Inmates struggle with longing. Both sides struggle to maintain connection across growing silence. Many inmates describe feeling like they are watching life happen from a distance they cannot cross. Importantly, this isolation is not always dramatic. There are no constant breakdowns, no visible crisis, just a steady reduction in connection. Fewer visits, shorter conversations, longer gaps between letters. The kind of isolation that settles in quietly and becomes part of daily life. Psychologically, distance can lead to emotional withdrawal. Some inmates protect themselves by lowering expectations. They stop hoping for visits. They prepare for missed calls. They tell themselves not to wait. This emotional distancing is not indifference, it is adaptation. When disappointment becomes routine, detachment feels safer. But detachment has consequences. As connection fades, motivation can decline. The sense of belonging weakens. Life outside feels abstract. Plans for the future feel uncertain. The world beyond the prison walls begins to feel unreal, not because it doesn't exist, but because access to it is limited. This is the first layer of isolation, not enforced through silence or solitude, but through miles, logistics, and time. Through geography that separates people from the relationships that ground them. Through distance that slowly reshapes how inmates experience connection, memory, and identity. And once distance becomes normal, isolation deepens further. Because when physical separation turns into emotional separation, the mind begins to adjust in ways that are far more difficult to reverse. When communication becomes a scarce resource. After distance separates inmates from the outside world, isolation deepens through something even more personal: limited communication. In prison, communication is never casual. It is scheduled, monitored, restricted, and rationed. For inmates in isolated facilities, this reality becomes even more pronounced. Phone calls, letters, and visits are not just methods of connection, they become lifelines. And when lifelines are limited, emotional strain follows. Phone calls are often the most immediate way inmates stay connected, yet they are far from simple. Access depends on availability, facility rules, and infrastructure. Calls may only be allowed during certain hours. Lines may be busy. Systems may be down. Lockdowns can cancel access without warning. What appears to be a small delay can feel significant when communication is already rare. Time limits add another layer of pressure. Calls are short. Conversations are compressed. There is rarely enough time to speak freely, reflect, or share details. Inmates and loved ones often rush through updates, prioritizing urgent information over emotional connection. How are you? Becomes a brief exchange rather than a genuine conversation. Over time, this changes how people communicate. Instead of sharing thoughts, people share summaries. Instead of emotions, they exchange facts. The richness of conversation fades, replaced by efficiency. This is not because people stop caring. It is because the system does not allow space for depth. Letters, while slower, carry their own challenges. Mail moves through multiple layers of screening and processing. Delivery can take days or weeks. Responses are delayed. Conversations stretch across long periods of time, losing rhythm and immediacy. By the time a response arrives, the emotional moment that inspired the letter may already have passed. This delay affects emotional expression. People hesitate to share vulnerable feelings when they know replies will be slow or uncertain. Writing becomes cautious. Tone is measured. Over time, letters can feel less personal and more formal, especially when inmates worry about how their words might be interpreted or delayed. Visits, when they happen, are often brief and structured. For inmates in isolated prisons, visiting days may be limited. Travel requirements reduce frequency. Once inside the visiting room, time feels compressed. Physical contact is restricted. Conversations take place under observation. Normal interaction becomes difficult to recreate in such an environment. When visits end, the contrast is sharp. The return to the cell feels heavier after moments of connection. Silence feels louder. The emotional distance feels greater because it has been briefly reduced. Many inmates describe visits as both comforting and painful. Comforting because they restore connection, painful because they remind them of what is missing. As communication becomes scarce, relationships adapt. Some families maintain contact through routine, scheduling calls and letters consistently. Others struggle to keep pace with restrictions and distance. Over time, communication may slow, not from lack of care, but from exhaustion. Maintaining connection across barriers requires energy, resources, and emotional resilience. For inmates, this can create uncertainty. They may wonder whether silence means absence or simply difficulty. They may hesitate to ask for reassurance, not wanting to burden loved ones. This uncertainty can quietly increase feelings of isolation, even when relationships technically still exist. Communication limits also affect identity. People define themselves through interaction, being heard, being known, being responded to. When communication becomes rare, that feedback loop weakens. Inmates may feel unseen, unheard, and disconnected from who they were outside prison. To cope, some begin to withdraw emotionally. Lowering expectations becomes a defense. If calls are missed, disappointment is avoided by not expecting them. If letters stop arriving, hope is reduced to prevent emotional strain. This withdrawal is not surrender. It is adaptation to scarcity. But adaptation carries long-term effects. When communication becomes infrequent, emotional expression can fade. Sharing feels unnecessary. Silence becomes familiar. Over time, some inmates report feeling emotionally distant not only from others, but from themselves. This is how isolation deepens, not through dramatic moments, but through consistent limitation, through communication that exists, but never fully, through contact that is present, but always conditional. Distance separated the body. Limited communication separates the heart. And as contact becomes harder to maintain, isolation moves beyond logistics, and it is something more personal: loneliness. Loneliness becomes the daily environment. When distance limits visits and communication becomes scarce, isolation settles into something quieter and more constant: loneliness. Loneliness in prison is not always about being physically alone. In many facilities, inmates are surrounded by people every day. Cells are shared. Yards are populated. Common areas are busy. And yet, loneliness persists because it is not defined by proximity. It is defined by lack of meaningful connection. In isolated prisons, loneliness becomes part of the environment. Without regular contact from the outside world, inmates often lose access to the relationships that once anchored their emotional lives. Family members, close friends, and familiar communities fade into the background. What remains is a world where interaction exists, but connection feels limited. Inside prison, relationships are shaped by circumstance. Trust is cautious. Conversations are guarded. People often avoid revealing personal emotions or vulnerabilities, not out of coldness, but out of self-protection. In an environment where privacy is rare and misunderstandings can carry consequences, emotional openness feels risky. As a result, many interactions remain surface level. People talk about daily events, small updates, or neutral topics. Deeper conversations about fear, regret, hope, or longing are often avoided. Over time, this creates an emotional gap. Inmates may speak to others every day, yet still feel unseen and unheard. This is how loneliness takes hold quietly. It doesn't arrive suddenly. It builds slowly as connections weaken and emotional expression narrows. Days pass with conversation, but without intimacy. Weeks pass without meaningful reassurance. Months pass without feeling truly known. For many inmates, nighttime intensifies this experience. As activity slows and noise fades, thoughts become louder. The mind drifts toward memories, relationships, and unanswered questions. Without distractions, absence becomes more noticeable. The people who once provided comfort feel distant, both physically and emotionally. This kind of loneliness can change how time is experienced. Moments stretch. Silence feels heavier. Waiting becomes more pronounced. Without regular emotional interaction, days can feel longer and less defined. The future feels distant. The present feels repetitive. To cope, inmates develop emotional strategies. Some turn inward, relying on routine, reading, or reflection to occupy the mind. Others seek connection through shared activities or quiet companionship. Some choose emotional detachment, convincing themselves not to miss what feels unreachable. This detachment is not a lack of feeling, it is a way to manage it. Over time, emotional expectations often shrink. Hope becomes cautious. Anticipation is muted. Joy is experienced quietly and briefly. This emotional narrowing helps reduce disappointment, but it also limits positive feeling. The mind learns to stay within a controlled emotional range. Loneliness also affects identity. People often understand who they are through relationships, how they are seen, valued, and responded to. When those mirrors disappear, self-image can blur. Inmates may feel less like participants in life and more like observers watching from a distance. This can lead to a sense of invisibility, not forgotten completely, but no longer central to anyone's daily life. The world continues, but without active involvement. Over time, this feeling can deepen into emotional fatigue. Caring becomes harder. Expressing emotion feels unnecessary. Importantly, this loneliness is rarely acknowledged openly. In prison culture, emotional vulnerability is often discouraged. Admitting loneliness can feel unsafe or embarrassing. As a result, many carry this experience silently. The absence of shared language around loneliness makes it harder to address, reinforcing the isolation. Yet despite its quiet nature, loneliness has weight. It shapes mood. It influences motivation. It alters how people relate to others and to themselves. Over long periods, it can dull emotional responsiveness, making it harder to reconnect even when opportunities arise. This is why isolation in prison is not just about being separated from others. It is about existing in an environment where connection is limited, guarded, and fragile, where loneliness becomes normalized, where emotional distance feels safer than emotional risk. And as loneliness settles into daily life, another change begins to take place, one that affects how inmates see themselves within the world. Because prolonged isolation does not only separate people from others, it can slowly separate them from their own sense of identity. Identity slowly fades in isolation. When isolation lasts long enough, its effects reach deeper than emotion. It begins to change how people see themselves. Inside prison, identity is already under pressure. Uniforms replace personal clothing. Numbers replace names in official records. Schedules replace personal choice. But in isolated prisons, where contact with the outside world is limited, identity does not just weaken, it slowly fades. For many inmates, identity is maintained through relationships. Being a parent, a sibling, a partner, a friend. These roles are reinforced through interaction. Conversations, shared experiences, and presence all remind people who they are to others. When those connections are reduced or disappear, the roles attached to them begin to feel distant. An inmate who once spoke daily with family may now speak only occasionally. A parent who once guided and supported a child may now receive delayed updates or none at all. Over time, these roles shift from lived experiences into memories. This creates an internal conflict. People know who they were, but they are no longer able to be that person. Without regular reinforcement, identity becomes fragile. Inmates may start defining themselves primarily by their incarceration rather than their life outside it. Instead of seeing themselves as part of a family or community, they begin to see themselves as someone who exists only within the prison environment. This shift is subtle but powerful. When identity narrows, aspirations narrow with it. Goals tied to life outside feel abstract. Plans feel distant. Motivation weakens, not because of lack of will, but because the future feels disconnected from the present. In isolated prisons, this process is accelerated. Distance from the outside world limits reminders of who someone was before incarceration. Familiar voices become rare. Shared history fades without reinforcement. Over time, inmates may feel as though their past life belongs to someone else. This can affect self-worth. People often measure their value through contribution, being needed, being relied upon, being present. When isolation removes opportunities to contribute meaningfully to loved ones' lives, self-esteem can decline. Inmates may feel replaceable, unnecessary, or forgotten. To cope, many adapt by simplifying identity. They focus on survival within the institution. They adopt roles that fit the prison environment: worker, quiet observer, rule follower. These roles provide structure and predictability, but they are limited. They do not reflect the full complexity of who a person is. Over time, the gap between internal identity and external role grows. Inside, a person may feel like a parent, a thinker, a creator. Outside, there is no space to express those roles. The longer this gap exists, the harder it becomes to maintain a sense of continuity between past, present, and future. This disconnection can also affect emotional expression. When identity feels unstable, people may hesitate to express themselves fully. They may avoid talking about their past or hopes for the future. The focus shifts to the immediate environment. Conversations stay grounded in the present moment. This narrowing of identity is not dramatic. There are no sudden realizations, no clear breaking point, just a gradual adjustment where old roles feel less relevant and new ones feel incomplete. The mind adapts by letting go of what cannot be sustained. Importantly, this process does not mean inmates stop caring about who they were. It means caring becomes painful. Holding on to an identity that cannot be lived creates emotional strain. Letting it fade reduces that strain. This is a form of emotional self-preservation, not defeat. But it carries consequences. When identity fades, reconnecting later becomes more difficult. After years of isolation, former inmates may struggle to step back into roles that once felt natural. Relationships may feel unfamiliar. Expectations may feel overwhelming. The world may feel faster, louder, and more demanding than remembered. This is why isolation has lasting effects beyond confinement. It reshapes not only how people feel, but how they understand themselves. It alters the internal narrative that guides behavior and decision-making. Even when physical isolation ends, its imprint can remain. Identity, once softened by distance and silence, takes time to rebuild. And for those still inside isolated prisons, this process continues quietly, day after day, without announcement. Because isolation does not erase identity all at once. It wears it down gradually, until the person left behind feels smaller than the life they once lived. And when identity weakens, one final challenge emerges: how to survive emotionally in a world where connection, recognition, and belonging are limited. That is where coping begins. Learning to cope when the world feels distant. When isolation stretches over months and years, survival depends on one essential skill: coping. In America's most isolated prisons, inmates cannot change distance, communication limits, or separation from loved ones. What they can change, slowly and carefully, is how they respond to it. Coping becomes less about comfort and more about endurance. Less about feeling good and more about staying stable. This process does not look the same for everyone. Some inmates cope by building structure within isolation. They develop personal routines that bring a sense of control where little exists. Reading at certain hours. Writing letters regularly, even when replies are rare. Exercising within limited space. These habits provide rhythm and predictability, offering small anchors in an environment defined by separation. Others cope through quiet connection. Friendships inside prison often form slowly and cautiously. Trust is built over time through consistency rather than intimacy. Shared silence can become a form of companionship. Sitting together without speaking. Acknowledging presence without expectation. These relationships may lack depth, but they reduce the feeling of being completely alone. For many, reflection becomes unavoidable. Without frequent external stimulation, the mind turns inward. Inmates revisit memories, decisions, and unresolved emotions. Some use this time for self-examination, trying to understand how they arrived where they are. Others avoid reflection altogether, focusing on the present to prevent emotional overload. Writing is a common coping tool. Letters, journals, and personal notes allow expression without interruption. Writing provides space to organize thoughts, preserve identity, and maintain a sense of continuity with the past. Even when letters are never sent, the act of writing can create a feeling of being heard. Faith and personal belief systems also play a role for some. Spiritual practices, meditation, or quiet contemplation offer meaning beyond immediate circumstances. These practices can help inmates frame isolation as a period of endurance rather than abandonment. Not everyone turns to belief, but for those who do, it can provide emotional grounding. Importantly, coping often involves emotional regulation. Many inmates learn to manage expectations carefully. They limit hope to avoid disappointment. They prepare for missed calls. They assume visits may not happen. This emotional moderation is not pessimism, it is protection. When expectations are low, emotional impact is easier to manage. However, coping is not the same as healing. While these strategies help inmates function, they do not eliminate the effects of isolation. Loneliness still exists. Identity still feels distant. Emotional fatigue still accumulates. Coping allows survival, not resolution. Over long periods, this can create emotional numbness. Some inmates describe feeling less reactive to both positive and negative events. Joy feels muted. Sadness feels controlled. Emotional balance is maintained by narrowing the range of feeling. This helps prevent emotional collapse, but it also limits emotional growth. Coping also affects future reintegration. Skills that help someone survive isolation, emotional restraint, low expectations, self-containment, can become obstacles later. Re-entering a world that expects openness, initiative, and connection can feel overwhelming. Adjusting back takes time. Despite this, coping reflects resilience. The ability to adapt under prolonged isolation demonstrates human flexibility. Inmates learn to survive without constant affirmation, recognition, or support. They endure environments that challenge basic social needs. This endurance is rarely visible, but it is significant. What is often missed in discussions about isolated prisons is this quiet resilience. There are no dramatic moments, no clear victories, just steady adjustment, day after day, year after year. A person learning how to remain emotionally intact in a place designed to limit connection. This is the final layer of isolation. Not distance, not silence, not loneliness alone, but the long-term process of learning how to live when connection is limited and recognition is rare. And while coping allows survival inside isolated prisons, it also leaves lasting marks, patterns of thought and behavior shaped by absence rather than presence. These marks do not disappear when isolation ends. They follow people forward. And that is why understanding isolation is not just about what happens inside prison walls, but about what happens long after. When isolation becomes a way of life. Isolation inside prison is not always loud or visible. It does not announce itself with force or spectacle. Instead, it works quietly, through distance, limited contact, and prolonged separation from the world beyond the walls. For those housed in America's most isolated prisons, being cut off is not a temporary condition. It is a daily reality shaped by geography, restricted communication, and emotional distance. Over time, separation becomes normal. Silence becomes familiar. Connection becomes something remembered rather than experienced. This kind of isolation does not erase people overnight. It changes them gradually. Relationships weaken without presence. Identity softens without reinforcement. Emotions narrow in response to long-term absence. And yet, within this environment, people adapt. They cope. They survive. Not through dramatic transformation, but through quiet endurance. Through routines, reflection, and small moments of human connection that remain possible even in separation. Understanding isolation in prison is not about assigning blame or passing judgment. It is about recognizing the human experience behind distance and silence. About acknowledging how separation reshapes lives long before release, and how its effects can follow people long after. Because incarceration is not only about confinement. It is about what happens when connection becomes rare, when the world continues without you, when being cut off becomes a way of life. And in those moments, survival is not measured by strength or defiance, but by the ability to endure absence. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.